Hello and welcome to What's the World Coming To? Today, what I want to talk about is the bad news about Bad Bunny. If you're not familiar with Bad Bunny, you probably will become more familiar with him as time goes on, especially if you're a fan of professional football and you plan on watching the Super Bowl. Because Bad Bunny is a entertainer from Puerto Rico who sings mainly in Spanish, but he has been selected to be the halftime entertainment for the Super Bowl. Now, if you're like me, most people have found entertainment at halftime of the Super Bowl has been really not all that enjoyable. In fact, there's probably a good many of us who simply go and turn it off and get something to eat and wait for the halftime shows to be over. But at the same time, there are literally hundreds of millions of people who will be watching it and consuming it, some out of curiosity and some out of fan devotion. And so the effort, of course, has been for decades now to find entertainers that reach the broadest audience, to create enough time to fill the airways and enabling the NFL and the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, or Fox, whoever is hosting it that year, to sell as much advertising as they possibly can. Now, I have to make a confession to you. I had never heard of Bad Bunny before it was announced that he was going to become the halftime entertainment for this year's NFL halftime show. But it's not the first time he's been in the halftime show. In fact, in 2020, back in COVID days, when Shakira and Jennifer Lopez were featured at the halftime show, they also had a guest there who was Bad Bunny. Now, you may have not noticed or paid much attention, but if you go back and look at a guy who kind of looks like he's kind of androgynous, you can't tell whether he's a guy or a gal, he's kind of in between, that would be Bad Bunny. He's an interesting character. So what's wrong with Bad Bunny? Why should that be a problem? Well, I feel like in many ways he's a bridge too far for most people. I hope for everybody. I understand that entertainment, and especially musical entertainment, has always tried to grasp onto something that's sensational, something that's on the edge, that's a little bit scandalous so that they can get the buzz of everybody talking about it. And they can also kind of hope to build some celebrity and basically broaden their audience. That's kind of built into it, whether we start with Elvis's hips being wiggled back and forth, or even, back when the Rolling Stones did it and they were in their wheelchairs getting tied up in their microphone cords. The whole point is, but this is something that's really, to me, is a bridge too far. It's crossed the line, at least for Christians, and I hopefully a whole lot more of us. In fact, I would quote from Jason Whitlock, who's a sportscaster, and he made the following statement regarding this choice of Bad Bunny. He said, "This is the poster boy for demonic activity, and it is yet another slap in the face of conservative Americans and Christians." He adds, "They didn't have to pick someone who was closely associated with demonic activity, so closely associated with promoting gender fluidity and the cross-dressing deal, so outspoken against Donald Trump and his immigration policy. This is the poster boy for Trump hate. And this is the poster boy for sexual fluidity, redefining masculinity. These are the things straight out of his own mouth. That's what globalism is teaching us, that we can throw away all of our Christian values and all of our American values in pursuit of global money. Money is the underlying issue that somewhere along the line, the NFL was convinced by Jay-Z Productions and their entertainment company that this was the best choice and it would generate the largest audience, create the most buzz, make the most money, and therefore sell the most advertisements or commercials possible. But you sit back and say, but who makes this choice? And initially, or essentially, bottom line is that the NFL makes these decisions. But the NFL, I fear, is suffering from what a lot of large corporations are suffering from. They have CEOs and chief economic officers and operating officers and board of directors who have really bought into the global mindset, the global wokeism. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but global wokeism is not so much about a lifestyle ideology as it is to basically breaking down a lot of values that people have in order so that they can basically insert their values which involves making you kind of a commercial captive of their industry. And therefore, they can continue to expand their economic footprint in the world. So the NFL really, I think the end result is that just like we saw with Cracker Barrel, where the CEO and the board of directors have all bought into the wokeism and almost destroyed, if not seriously damaging the brand. I don't know that Cracker Barrel will ever come back. I have no interest in going there, although my wife is in love with their pecan pancakes. But be that as it may, I have a hard time going back in their store knowing that they are really controlled by this kind of a group wokesters. But also it's kind of like they don't think that they have to concern themselves with the Bud Light effect or the Target dynamic, or even, as I said, with Cracker Barrel or Disney and other corporations who have lost literally billions of dollars because they've tried to force this ideology on us. And I think they think they're immune to it, because not watching the Super Bowl is kind of like skipping Christmas for a lot of Americans. And we have become accustomed to having halftime shows that we can't stomach. And so, as I said, we just turn them off. But I think the only thing that will get the NFL's attention is if you and I just don't watch at all. Because the bottom line is they do the Arbitron surveys, they find out how many viewers are watching. If the viewership drops, then they begin to basically do their mea culpas and change their formatting. And sometimes it leads to the firing of a lot of people in executive positions. That seems to be the only way it works, because the only language that most corporations speak is money. They speak the fiduciary language of income and expenses. And basically, if there's not corporate growth, then those people are in trouble. So they very quickly let go of any kind of principles they might or might not have, or adopt new ones in order to keep themselves in a place where the income is flowing and not being interrupted. But also, it's the decision that's made some time ago that Jay-Z and Rock Nation, which is his entertainment company, would be the ones who would provide the entertainers each year. Basically, they recommend whom they think would be the best individual. And so far, the NFL has never turned down their decisions, because I think in reality, it's always been financially beneficial to them to do so. But the thing that many of us don't realize, and I had to do some research to even discover this, because who cares about this information besides guys like me trying to do podcasts and trying to anticipate the questions you're going to ask me? The bottom line is that Jay-Z is closely allied with GLAAD, which means the Gay, Lesbian, Anti-Alliance Against Defamation. In other words, it's an organization that is designed to promote the LGBTQ agenda. And that's what they're all about. They're usually funded by people like Jay-Z and Rock Nation, who make large donations to them, along with a lot of people like the Soros Foundation and scores of others of billionaires who share the same ideology and want to push the same agenda. And so, in fact, Jay-Z has been very public about how he stands on these things, especially after his mother a few years ago came out that she had basically come out of the closet as a lesbian. But he made this statement. He said, "What people do in their own homes is their business. You can choose to love whoever you love. It is no different than discriminating against blacks. It's discrimination, plain and simple." So people like Jay-Z and others feel like this is some kind of moral, social, ideological high ground, that they're almost out there with Martin Luther King marching in Selma, that they're in the forefront of that. Of course, they do it from their multi-million-dollar suites in high-rise apartments where they're insulated and driven around by inexpensive cars and fly their private planes and are surrounded by security, but they still see themselves as being people who are striving for equal rights by those who are discriminated against. It's kind of a skewed perspective, but there again, if you live in an echo chamber where nobody ever challenges what you believe and just basically tells you it's okay to do whatever you want, then you tend to be people who engage in excessive behavior of one kind or another. But there's also another sponsor, and that's Apple Music. Apple Music gives their input. And keep in mind, Tom Cook, who is the Tim Cook, excuse me, who's the president of Apple, is himself a gay man, and he supports the same agenda as well. And so when we were trying to figure out why does Apple have a ICE tracking app on their apps in their app store, well, part of it is because he is, even though he'll sit with Trump and have dinner with him for financial and government protection, at the same time, he still believes in the same things that many of the liberals in Hollywood and Silicon Valley believe as well. And so this isn't something that would even cause him to look twice or think twice about it, because in some way, these guys, to get where they are, have to be amoral. Now, one of the things that I argue is that, that things like homosexual or lesbian or transsexual behaviors and attitudes and lifestyles, they themselves are such open and apparent lies. You have to believe a lie, but once you believe a lie, then lying no longer becomes a lie, and you don't feel uncomfortable lying. You start living by lies. So if you're a gay man and you convince yourself that it's okay, in fact, it's even good and advantageous to be a gay man, you have lied to yourself so many times repeatedly to justify and silence your own conscience that any lie becomes easy and comfortable. And you lie to yourself so that, like most narcissistic and sociopathic personalities, you simply believe that whatever you say is true. If it comes out of your mouth, that is the definition of true. And anybody who objects to that is your enemy and needs to be silenced. As people like me find that there are people who really want to violently silence our voices because they don't like what we're saying to them. But for us, basically, the truth is truth, and a lot of us have decided we just can't live by lies. That was Solzhenitsyn's advice: don't live by lies. And when he convinced enough Russians not to do that, that's when the Soviet Union began to fall apart, because they not only didn't believe in lies, but they also started making memes and jokes and humors and cartoons. You see, once you laugh at a despot and get other people laughing at a despot, they lose their hold and power. Other people stop taking him seriously. And so that's the place that humor has in dealing with totalitarian despotic behaviors. One of the things that makes me, and I'm kind of getting on a rabbit trail here, but one of the things that makes me fairly comfortable with Donald Trump is the fact that he is not afraid to be laughed at. He doesn't get upset when people tease and make fun of him and say things. He gives it right back to them, but he can take a joke. Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. Joe wouldn't even get the joke, but these people, they can't take it. They can't stand it that anybody's laughing at them. And so that's where you need to be really careful. They can say that things are undemocratic and it's a tyrant and he's a despot and he's a fascist. But when somebody can laugh at themselves and allow other people to make fun of them and imitate them and make jokes on their behalf, that's a person who's pretty safe. It's the people who will not allow you to use humor that we need to be concerned about. But why would I tie all of this into, why does Bad Bunny even figure into a discussion about things that are coming in the future in the last days? Well, I think that one of the most overlooked signs of the times is what Paul wrote when he wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 3, when he said, the last days will be, it's very translated, perilous, difficult, and dangerous. It really, the original language encapsulates all those ideas, that it'll be perilous and dangerous, and therefore will become very difficult for people of faith and people of integrity. And so as a consequence, we read that, but we don't really recognize that what he's talking about is the personality trait of people generally in the last days. In the last days, if I were to put it into a summary statement, I would say that most people are going to be narcissistic sociopaths, someplace on that cluster B spectrum, and they're going to be people that you don't want to have as part of your life. But it's interesting because what we find that Paul said is almost identical to what a historian, General Sir John Glubb, who coincidentally was in charge of the Palestinian Authority before World War II, he wrote a book called Fate of Empires. And in it, he traced really the life cycles of great nations and even empires. He said they have a time where they begin, they rise, they become great, and then they fall. And so he says about a 250-year arc from the point where they start from the very beginning with some brave, disciplined, sacrificial pioneers who start their nations, and ultimately reaches a pinnacle of power and hegemony where they have influence around the world, great wealth, great prosperity, prosperity, great technological and sociological and scientific advantages. They live in large cities with large populations, and on it goes, with big armies and the latest equipment and machinery. And they hit this point, and it's almost as if they hit the apex as soon as they begin to go downhill very, very quickly. And the reason, he says, is because it's basically their culture becomes corrupt. And then you find these things, culture and civilization, oftentimes are spoken of in the same word, as if they're basically the same thing, but they're not. That culture is the soul of a civilization. Civilization is talking about the external structure of a country. We often talk about the seven mountains of society. Some have twisted it, as I've said before, into the seven mountain mandate, and I don't think it's any mandate whatsoever. That's a fiction. But when Bill Bright and Frank Schaeffer were using that term of seven mountains of cultural influence, they were talking about things like the business world, the religious world, the arts and scientists and entertainment. In other words, they had these seven areas where they said academia and so forth, that really were the things that were formative to a culture and created the sense of ideals and values. And that's what culture is. Culture are the ideals and values that people embrace on the inside. And so we call it the soul of the civilization. And what John Glubb was talking about is how that the culture begins to become corrupted because of its prosperity and because of its security and because of its overabundance of just about everything, and its sense of entitlement. There's kind of this idea that we are great because we are great people. And, I'm not saying that there aren't great people, but great people are people who walk by integrity and self-discipline, self-sacrifice. It's their character that makes them great, not the fact that they just happen to inherit the same set of genes as their parents had before them. Genetics never predisposes anybody to greatness, which is one of the greatest arguments against evolution I can think of, because a lot of people had great parents who became far less than great. But again, I digress. But the underlying issue is that you have to recognize that when the culture, which is the thing you should be watched, not the civilization, not the size of their armies, not the size of their economies, not the size of their external hegemony and control of nations and empires. No, what's going on in the inside on the day-to-day life of people? What are the choices that they're making? And Glubb said there was, there's 21 different things that he pointed to, but I really wanted to isolate maybe 5 or 6 that I think are critical. That number one, he said there would be an indifference and hostility towards religion. The way Paul put it said, they will consider nothing to be sacred. That's an important distinction. In other words, they're not kind of irreligious. It's not like they're non-religious. They almost have a religion. In fact, later on, Paul will say they have a form of godliness, but they deny its power. In other words, they don't let godliness affect their lifestyle. So they have a religious structure, a religious culture that is living within a religious civilization, but they're not very religious. You know what I'm talking about. It's not even to the point of being hypocrisy, because they don't see themselves as being inconsistent. It's like most people celebrate Christmas and Easter, not because they're Christians, but because they're great holidays. But it has no other meaning for them whatsoever. And so he says what happens is, at the very best, people are indifferent because they don't see God as a factor in their life. That's what the word ungodly means. It means without God. In other words, they live life as if there is no God. In fact, there are people like Daryl Dawkins and many in the evolutionary community who basically say God is not a factor. All that matters is the material universe. So we have to keep in mind, he said, this is going to be one of the characteristics. No matter what the religious system is in that culture, they no longer have a fear of God. They don't think about God as being a factor. They think that they and what they feel and what they want is the only factor that they need to consider. So it's really that mantra that, we had in the hippie days: if it feels good, do it. And so you find people say that my whole purpose in living is to fulfill myself in whatever way I define fulfillment, to the best of my ability, to the furthest extent, within the shortest period of time that I have in this time I have on the earth. They never give a thought to the fact that they're going to stand before God at the end of it. So there's an indifference. Now, on the other stream, there's a hostility towards religion. And that's where they start hating any particular religious expression, as we see a hostility towards biblical Christianity. Not just Christianity. In fact, many who are very anti-religious would say, well, we support Christians who aren't the judgmental kind of Christians. So they're really anti-biblical Christianity. So we see that happening in our culture right now. Secondly, he said that there would be a materialism. In other words, if you can't touch it, feel it, smell it, taste it, hold it, possess it, control it, then it's not of interest to you. So that they never look for the spiritual dimension of anything in life. And if they do, it's into the occult or the dark forces, which they basically see as powers that they can control to help them gain the material things they want to gain. In fact, the few people I've ever had dealt with who were delivered from demon possession said that the whole reason that they allowed themselves to be possessed was because the demon promised to give them the power to acquire what they wanted. And I found with the young men, a lot of times it was to be sexually attractive to young, beautiful women. And that was why they wanted that power, and they gave themselves over, is to have that power to control other people, especially women, to get them to do for them what they wanted to have done. And that's the whole point. They believe in a spiritual dimension, but they believe it in a very materialistic way because it's just simply another power source that they're trying to plug into in order to direct them all the material wants that they have into their own pocket. And then thirdly, he said they would be hedonistic. I mean, that's interesting because he said there would be a rampant sexual immorality. Hedonism is this idea that I live for my sensual pleasures. Now, it sounds a lot like the materialism, but the materialist believes I got to have things, I have to have money to be able to fulfill my sensual desires. So the two link up very easily. But the bottom line is when Paul talks about it, he says they will love pleasure rather than God, and there will be no self-control. They will hate what is good. In other words, they see the idea of virtue and goodness as being a barrier, an obstacle to their desire for physical sensation and pleasure. So when you look at the change from, we start off saying, well, people are going to be fornicators. We can't do anything about it. So we need to teach our kids how to keep from getting pregnant. And then we say, well, because we weren't successful in keeping them from getting pregnant, now we have to figure out ways to keep them from having children. So we give into abortion. And then once we get people accustomed to the idea that abortion is okay and it's no big deal, then we begin to say that you can engage in all sorts of sexual behavior, even if it's outside the context of a married relationship or even in an open marriage where you engage in physical intimacy with people other than the one that you've committed to be with till death do you part. And you don't see marriage as being sacred. You don't see marriage as being a covenant between you and God and the person that you married. You just see it as a contractual relationship that was designed to get you certain things that you wanted. And if you don't get those things, then you want to dissolve the contract and go find somebody else to make another contract, or even have a non-binding contract, which means I call living together or shacking up. And so we see that becomes acceptable. At some point when you engage in sexual intimacy, even the most normal forms of heterosexual interaction become boring. So you start looking for ways to spice it up, and you go into darker and darker and more profane features of that experience. And ultimately, when people end up into pedophilia and bestiality, how did they get there? Well, they didn't start there. They started by living for their sensual pleasures, and they, like a drug addict, they have to keep on increasing the dosage, the impact, the strength of the drug that they're taking, or the impact of their sexual activity, and it will take them from the heterosexual into the homosexual, into the transsexual, into the pedophilia, into the bestiality. It's just a matter of time. Now, not everybody survives long enough to get to the end of that trail, but that's where it ends up. That's where it always becomes viable and acceptable, even to the point of what we call necrophilia, which is, I'll let you look that one up. I don't even want to talk about that one. But then he says, what happens, you see, in the greater society, that the leaders of your countries become increasingly corrupt. I love the way that Ed Glub puts it. He says that most politicians will go into office poor and they'll leave rich. You know, so we look at a lot of our political leaders today and we wonder, how is it they're getting a salary of $250,000 to $400,000 a year, and yet they become multi-millionaires in the form of hundreds of millions of dollars? And it's pretty easy to see that they've created systems where they can steal from the public coffers or use their positions of power to enrich themselves in other ways through various kinds of lobbyists and organizations. That's why part of our medical problems is that our government medical institutions have been taken captive of corporate interests in the pharmaceutical world and the health insurance companies and so forth. That those companies, health insurance and pharmaceuticals, control medical care and treatment in this country, and they do it at an ever-increasing cost. This is what happens. Corruption comes. And interesting that as the leaders become more corrupt, their measurement of success is by how much influence they can wield, not how good they are at leading or how good they are at governing. In fact, you end up having a large number of what we call incompetent leaders. So when you try to understand how does somebody like AOC, who has never accomplished anything in her life, or even this Mamdani in New York, who basically grew up the son of a Marxist professor at an Ivy League college, and basically became a teacher in an Ivy League college for a short time, and now became a state assemblyman for a while, and now is running for the mayor of New York City, the biggest, most important, and most powerful city in the world. How does that happen? He's never done anything. He's never governed anything. And that's it. He's a real smooth talker, and he says things with a smile. But the bottom line is he's incompetent, and he will prove his level of incompetence if he does, in fact, get elected. But the last one is the one I want to hit on, which brings me back to Bad Bunny and all the rest of this. One of the things that John Glubb said was that the influencers in our culture would be people who are the celebrities. He said popular singers and entertainers would be the people who really have the greatest influence upon the culture. Now, the fact that we are in that is evidenced by the way celebrities are looked at in our society. I mean, think about the last election, how that Kamala Harris had hired, we find out now, for sometimes millions of dollars, all sorts of top-line celebrities to come and just show up at her rallies. Most of them never sang or even performed. People came by the thousand to see them perform. They'd walk up and say, I endorse this person, and therefore give her your vote. And then they walk off the stage, and people are going, what happened? What we weren't told, and the videos weren't shown by the cameras, was that many of those people just got up and walked out because they didn't want to hear a word salad. They wanted to see the entertainment that was going to be put on. Well, the problem is when you get to that place, you find that the influencers basically will lead people in the wrong way. In fact, the way that Paul expressed it he says, they will not endure sound doctrine. In other words, they won't take things that are true. They won't follow things that are true. They aren't interested in, is it true or not? Because they not only don't believe in truth, they certainly don't believe in absolute truth. They believe that truth is fungible. Basically, you have your truth, I have my truth. And so therefore, you can't tell me that my truth's wrong because it's my truth. And therefore, that's where our conversation ends. And if you don't accept my truth, then I reject you as a person. And so you live in this place where cohesion and civility begins to fall apart within a culture because everybody is becoming a god unto themselves. When you read the book of Judges in the Old Testament, the last 5 chapters are interesting because they describe a period of chaos in the land of Israel. And they give the same reason 5 times. They tell us why everything had become so chaotic. And they said, because there was no king in the land. In other words, there was no central authority. And he says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so when you have a culture where everybody becomes a god unto themselves, every one of them becomes their own personal truth detector. And if you don't conform or support them in what they say, then they reject you. Well, you're in a situation where the society is going to begin to pull apart because there can be no cohesion. When Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, he said, if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, how will the soldiers know how to react? So in the days when the blowing of a trumpet meant that there were different signals that told them what to do, he says, if it makes a sound that nobody recognizes, nobody's going to know which direction to go. And that's what happens in a society when we no longer have a centralized focus of what truth is and what right and wrong is, what good and evil is, what falsehood and truth is. I mean, when we don't have those absolutes, when we fall into that place that Isaiah warned about in Isaiah 5:20, when he said, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. In other words, he's describing, if you don't notice, a kind of downward projection. It starts by saying that something that is evil is good. But eventually, it'll go all the way around and we'll start saying that something that is good is evil. So we're not only anti-God, we're anti-goodness. And he said that when we'll look at things that are dark and we'll call them light, eventually darkness will become our light. The darker a thing is, the more we see things more clearly, at least we believe. In the same way, as he said, that we'll take something that's bitter and we'll say that that's sweet, and before long, something that is horribly bitter tastes good to us. So this is a downward spiral that people go down to. And he says, that's what happens when you lose your definitions, your central focus. You begin to believe that lies are true. And that's really what really bothers me most about the Bad Bunny issue, if you will. Because what it is putting out here in front of the world, especially young people, saying, this evil is good. This darkness is light. This sweetness, this bitterness is sweet. And before long, young people are beginning to go, not only is that darkness light, but darkness is light. Not only is that evil good, but goodness is doing evil. You see, there's this whole twisting that takes place. Not only are things that are bitter and repulsive and hard to bear good, but basically the biggest good you can do is to do your evil. There's a real life parallel. There's a book written some years ago about a missionary couple that went to New Guinea to reach basically the cannibal tribe that was buried deep in the jungle there. And the biggest problem they had is in that culture, the highest good you could attain to was to deceive an enemy into thinking you were his friend, and then when he's not watching, kill him and eat him. Now, you look at that and go, that's so twisted and wrong. But you have to keep in mind, they didn't start there. That started way back when they started saying, well, good is evil. And then they came to a place where they were doing evil things of the most horrible kind and saying they're good. Or let's go back to October 7th, 2023, where these 6,000 Gazan residents, followed by 2,000 other non-combatants who came with them and flooded across the border and murdered in the most barbaric and savage way over 1,200 Israelis, men, women, and even children, decapitating, cutting women's guts open, and on it goes. Last March, I went to that area and saw the consequences myself, and it's incomprehensible. Even when you're there, you can't get your mind around how anybody could be so savage. How they laughed and rejoiced as they tortured and tormented and burned people alive and did the worst things to them. And you're saying, how does somebody get there? And it's because Hamas and the jihadists of the various stripes throughout the Middle East have been teaching for decades children from the youngest age, the highest good you can do is to kill a Jew. And so they call the evil of murder the highest good. And so any of us can be warped in that way if we're subject to those kind of influences. So what does Satan want to do with putting Bad Bunny in front of the world and have millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people who come to watch the Super Bowl, and they are entertained by the deepest, darkest expression of sexual immorality and perversion? What does he want us to do? He wants young minds, young kids sitting there and start going, well, the music's good, the beat's good. Can't judge everything. You got to judge a tree by its fruit. And I like the sound. I like the rhythm. I like the music. So I guess it's good. And not realizing that you're just endorsing demonic activity of the worst kind. So what am I saying? So as you and I Christians, how should we respond to this? I think the most adequate response, and I fear that not many people, even good, solid Bible-believing Christians who are avid football fans, would agree with me. But I think the most adequate response is simply saying, we're not watching the Super Bowl. I have to make a confession. It's easy for me because when the NFL started bending a knee for George Floyd, or when they started doing the COVID shutdowns and all that kind of stuff, I stopped watching most sports altogether. And I'm not a great sportsman. I've never a great athlete, but I can run in a straight line and fall down. But the point was that this had been a great form of entertainment for me and my family for years. And yet I looked at it and said, I don't want to support or endorse something that's wrong, that's evil, that's promoting something that's not true, that's not good. And so for me, it's easy to say, I'm not watching the Super Bowl. And besides, I live in Seahawk country and they haven't been in the Super Bowl for so long. I've kind of given up. It's the same with the Mariners in the World Series. So, maybe it's easier for me than it would be for you. I get that. But I think that you need to decide what you're going to do. I would say at the very least, tell your kids, that you're not going to watch the halftime show because they're portraying somebody who is ruled by demons and is promoting evil and darkness, and that's why you're not going to watch it? It may be great to have a discussion with them during halftime and explain to them why you feel the way you do and what the basis of that is. Who knows? I mean, you could put this podcast on, but it probably lasts longer than the halftime show. Anyway, but to be able to really be able to say to them, this is why we do it. Because in a way, that's what I did with my sons. I remember my oldest son and I were watching a football game together one time when he was still living at home as a teenager. And they had this beer commercial, and these four beautiful buxom blondes were bouncing around. And basically, because this guy was drinking this brand of beer, all the girls were all over him. And I just said to my son, don't you get the impression that they're trying to say to us, if you drink your beer, you'll have these beautiful blonde, buxom blondes chasing after you? Beautiful blonde, buxom bimbos. That'd be a better way of saying it, right? They'd be chasing after you. And he kind of chuckled and laughed. It came on again. I said the same thing to him, and he laughed again. The third time it came on, and I said it again, he looked at me and says, okay, I get it. I get the point. And that was what I wanted. I just wanted him to get the point, because I knew that I couldn't protect his eyes from seeing everything forever. But I knew that he also had to have a reason for why he shouldn't be deceived by that commercial. Because when you're a young man, beautiful blondes, buxom bimbos are hard to resist. And so I wanted him to know why he needed to use his brain and not just simply respond with his hormones. So that's what I would encourage you to do at the very least. Have that conversation with your kids. If you can't do that, just turn it off and walk away. They may be too young to understand it. You know, it's like Corrie ten Boom said when she was a girl of 5 years old and she was riding the train with her father, and she'd heard this word that she didn't know. It was the word sex. And she said, Papa, what does the word sex mean? And her dad sat quietly for a while, and then he said, Corrie, when we reach the train station, I want you to pick up the suitcase and carry it off the train for me. And she said, Papa, your suitcase is too heavy for me to pick up. And he says, Corrie, so is the word sex. It's too heavy at your age to pick up. And she said it was an adequate answer. But you see, that's the point. I think we need to be sensitive to that, because our kids are being obviously exposed to a whole lot of things that they shouldn't be, because they have access to information through devices that you need to make sure that you have at least control over, if not just simply keeping them out of your homes for as long as you can. One last thing, what can you do? Well, you can express your outrage by, writing to the NFL. You can go on their website and sending them a message. They always have these little contact us. And if enough people start writing in saying, we're not watching the Super Bowl this year because you have chosen this artist. We've seen this trend going on for years now, and we're just not watching it anymore because you are promoting something we find objectionable to our values. And just say it right out to them. And, it's not like saying you're going to go to hell because these are your values, which may be in fact the case, but at least you're communicating in a way that says to them, we're not going to support what you're doing, because it contradicts our values. And until you start thinking about our values, we're not going to consider watching your programming. The more we do that, the more we can control the narrative and control the environment we're in. We're seeing what happened to Target. We're seeing what happened to Disney. We're seeing what happened to Bud Light and a whole raft of different people who have decided to sign on to this. That's why I may have to learn how to make pecan pancakes to keep my wife happy, because neither one of us are very interested in visiting a Cracker Barrel, and we used to love Cracker Barrel. So I had some of the best fried chicken in my life in a Cracker Barrel. So anyway, but saying that, I hope you'll consider these things, reflect upon them, and I want to thank you for just taking the time to hear what I have to say, these things that are pretty heavy on my heart. I think we're in just such significant times in human history, and we also have an opportunity to live in a way that adds definition to the truth of the gospel, instead of just going silent and pretending like we're not here. Evil forces want us to be silent. Wasn't it Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that silence is its own form of evil? So let's speak the truth and not be so silent that people don't know what we stand for. God bless you. Go in His grace. Thank you.